today's episode, I want to dive into the hot topic of the XL bully ban, and more specifically to explore some of the implications across the veterinary and the animal welfare sectors. I want to explore how vets and pet owners are coping with the emotional and practical implications of this ban. And I want to talk about some of the longer term consequences we are all going to have to face. Now, the XL bully ban is upon us. And from the end of December 2023, it has become illegal to own this breed type. Alongside ownership, there are also bans on being able to breed, rehome, or sell XL bullies. Owners have been allowed to apply for an exemption to this ban, and they have until the end of January 2024 to apply. However, dogs, as part of this exemption, must be microchipped, they must be neutered, and they're only allowed in public on a lead and with a muzzle. Now, you've got to have been living under a rock not to have heard something about the XL bully ban. But the ban, it was introduced really swiftly as a result of a number of high-profile dog attacks, some of which have ended tragically in fatalities. But the ban was put into place rather quickly, and by some has been described as a bit of knee-jerk legislation. But the subject of dangerous dogs and incidents of aggression has been kind of bubbling away in the background for quite some time, and it has been quite clear that whatever has been in place to try and control dangerous dogs has not worked, because the number of incidents of dangerous dogs attacks has been going up, increasing year on year. So this legislation has been introduced quite quickly. It's incredibly divisive, both across the public and indeed within the veterinary sector. And as a leader in the veterinary charity sector, this has been particularly hard trying to navigate the last few months. And I really wanted to talk about the impact across not just the veterinary charity sector, across the whole veterinary sector. And I guess I wanted to start with, my kind of personal experiences, because when I first joined the profession, I was working in East London and then South East London, which are areas that have got particularly high density dog population. And they have a high population of these so-called status dogs, where people breed and acquire dogs that look a certain way. And I've seen both sides of this debate, in that I've been presented, because when I first joined the profession, there was lots of talk around pit bulls, especially in East London. There was a big community of people that actually were very proud of owning pit bulls, despite this breed having been banned. And as there is with the XL bullies, there was an exemption scheme in place. People had to comply with certain conditions in order to keep these dogs. So we used to see a lot of pit bulls, and the dogs that I used to see at that point, because the ban had been in place for some time, were all really loved family pets. They were all very well adjusted, very well socialized. And I remember experiencing these dogs and thinking, wow, this ban's crazy, isn't it? This breed specific legislation is just so indiscriminate, because these dogs that I'm seeing are really nice, lovely dogs. So, there's no way they should be banned. But at the same time, we were also seeing a high number of dog-on-dog aggression incidents. And there was a lot of very active kind of people with fighting dogs in the area. And some of the dog attacks that I used to see were absolutely horrific. And I remember I'd just joined as head vet at a hospital in New Cross in South East London. And a dog was brought in, and it had been attacked in the park. It was owned by an elderly couple. It was a little Yorkshire Terrier. And I always remember this because this dog had been literally torn apart. And it was brought in and it was barely recognizable, and it had been set upon by two dogs who were considered at the time American bulldogs or mastiffs. And I just remember it was one of the most traumatic things that you'd seen, because everybody was obviously horrified at this dog, which ultimately was had to be euthanized because of the extent of its injuries. But the trauma surrounding the incident, the actual owners of the dog, the elderly couple, had also been mauled, so the husband had to go to hospital as well. So I've seen the consequences of out of control aggressive dogs as well. And one thing that's really difficult in this situation is that these dogs that have been banned are essentially large, powerful dogs. But that doesn't mean that they're all aggressive. And actually, I would probably assume that the majority of these dogs are not aggressive. There are a number of them that could potentially be aggressive, but any dog could be aggressive. So it's kind of for me, it's a difficult one, because whilst I appreciate something needs to be done with the rising incidence of dog aggression, blanket bans on breeds don't seem to work. And we've got lots of evidence over the years on breed-specific legislation that suggests this doesn't work. But there's a call to action, and there has been a call to action. There's been increased media attention, and it felt like the government was reacting to the pressure from the public to introduce something. And so the ban has come into force. Now, the implications in the veterinary sector are actually quite huge. And one thing that it probably be noted is, to comply with the ban, owners have to meet a set of certain conditions. And in those conditions are things like muzzling and lead training. Now, of those, veterinary surgeons have to help and support owners with quite a number of them, specifically neutering, microchipping, but also potentially advice on the other things as well. And if an owner gets to a point where they don't feel they can keep their dog and they have to consider euthanasia, again, veterinary surgeons are the only ones, that can perform the act of euthanasia for that owner. Now, it's a real challenging one. And I remember sitting with a group of vets looking at the number of potential XL bully type dogs that we had on our books in the charity that I work for, and considering how are we going to be able to deliver this work if all these dogs, that potentially are unneutered, need to come in to be neutered, and the deadlines that the government set are fairly tight. If your dog is over a year old at the time the ban comes into place, they've got to be done by end of June 2024. If your dog's under a year old, you've got until the end of the year, end of December 2024. But still, when you look at the numbers of the dogs, it still looks incredibly challenging. Another worst case scenario is what if a large number of these people decide that they're going to make the difficult decision to put their dogs to sleep? Again, when you look at the numbers, it's going to be incredibly challenging to be able to deliver that. Now, the government are sticking steadfastly to a number estimate of these dogs of around 15,000. Now, I think that's really, really unlikely. I think there are likely to be many more dogs than that. And the reason I think that is because the number of dogs that we have registered on our books at the charity I work for, plus the number of dogs registered in the charity that I used to work for, is approaching around 12,000 dogs. Now, that's only two charities out of all the other veterinary service providers across the UK. So to come to a number of 15,000, I think, is a huge underestimation. And actually, animal charities are estimating, and animal welfare organisations are estimating, that these numbers could be anywhere from 50 to 100,000 and upwards. One of the complicating factors in this is the very broad breed standard that's been created by DEFRA, which is the guide to help and understand what is an XL bully by definition of the breed standard. And that is quite a broad. Again, it was something that was put together quite quickly, I've got to say, because it didn't exist prior to the ban being announced. So again, it's something that's been hastily put together, and within this breed standard could be a number of dogs that we might not consider to be XL bullies, because at the moment it's quite subjective what people consider to be an XL bully and what people don't. So this is the challenge. But when you look at those numbers, if those estimates, even at 15,000, that is a significant amount of work to put on the veterinary sector. And when you look at the challenges that are currently being faced in veterinary at the moment, so we have got a workforce crisis, which has been going on for, a number of years now, where we've got a shortage of vets and nurses. So we're struggling to deliver the work that we already have. We have highly reported incidents of mental health problems where burnout, dropout, and even suicide are kind of widely reported, and building this narrative in the veterinary sector, which are causing a lot of people to really consider whether this is the right career for them. And as a result of this ban, there is increased reports of moral distress, ethical kind of dilemmas, and compassion fatigue, which again are all features of a sector that is, it's tired and it's burnt out and it's struggled to recover from the pandemic even. So I think that when we start looking at these numbers of dogs, we have to face into some really difficult and challenging decisions. And I remember sitting when this ban was announced with a group of vets and quickly working out that actually this wasn't a question of how are we going to deliver this extra work, but a question of what are we going to have to stop in order to deliver this work. And that's a really challenging question, especially when your work is driven by your desire to help people and animals and your desire to improve animal health and welfare. And I know that we got to a place as a group of vets that we had to prioritize based on welfare needs. And the only way that we could consider or, being able to deliver this extra work, and that is the extra work of XL bully neutering, or the extra work of microchipping, and the extra work of potentially euthanizing these dogs. The only way we can deliver that is if we stop doing activities. And the only activity that we felt we could justify stopping from a welfare perspective would be vaccination of other animals or all other type of neutering. And that's a really tough decision to make, because there are health and welfare implications of not vaccinating animals. There are health and welfare implications of not neutering animals. And but if it was the difference between an owner being able to comply with a mandatory ban or not, then that felt like it would have to take priority over something. And it also must be remembered that these dogs are big dogs, and they are, even when they're nice-natured, they can be a challenge to manage in the veterinary clinic because they're big, they're strong. Even anaesthetics can be challenging because they require a lot of a drug, so it's a costly anaesthetic. They require a lot of people to help to lift and to manually handle them when they're under anaesthetic, and they need a lot of support and recovery. So, not all dog neutering is equal, and when you're proportionally moving towards neutering XL bullies, it does change operationally what you can deliver. So this is challenging operationally, and when vets are looking at this work that's coming their way, work that they didn't ask for, and there are some very angry people in the profession, if I'm going to be perfectly honest, because vets don't necessarily feel like they were consulted in this ban. And yet, when you look at it, regardless of whether you agree with the ban or not, and I can say that this ban has been divisive in the veterinary community, and I will talk at length about that. And I think that'll probably going to have to be in another podcast because it's such a big subject. But regardless of whether, as a veterinary professional, you agree with the ban or not, people are going to be coming to you to help them either comply with the ban, or if they've decided that they can't keep their dog anymore. Either which way, veterinary surgeons are the ones that are going to facilitate an owner's decision. So it's put the veterinary sector in a very difficult situation. It's put them in a situation whereby whether or not they agree with the legislation, it becomes irrelevant because they are going to be called upon to support owners. Whether they agree that people should keep XL bullies becomes irrelevant because, these people are going to present to veterinary surgeons for support. And whether or not they agree with, for example, whether they agree with neutering certain animals. So, for example, the government have taken a hard line on neutering animals that potentially have health conditions, which would normally preclude them from the neutering procedure. The bottom line is that they have to be neutered. And that is really conflicting for a veterinary surgeon if they know that there are potential risks or implications of neutering an animal. And so it's a really challenging one. And on top of all that, there are a number of vets who really just don't agree morally and ethically with euthanizing healthy animals. And that is starting to, throw up some potential challenges because the decisions that people may have to make around euthanasia can be quite complex. They're not always related to health or behavior. Sometimes they can be related to whether or not somebody can afford to keep an animal, whether or not they practically are able to support the health and welfare of that animal. But the avenues that people would traditionally have if they could not keep that animal have been taken away. Rehoming centres, it is now illegal for them to rehome dogs. So there is no way that any animal that's admitted can ever be rehomed. And this is a really tricky one because, I've spoken personally to vets who are being very vocal about their belief that we shouldn't be euthanizing these dogs, especially if they're healthy and they're behaviorally sound. But at the same time, I spoke to a pet owner last week who had basically made the decision that they could no longer keep their dog. They had no opportunity to rehome it. They had no opportunity to give it away, sell it. That's all illegal now. So they had made the decision that they had no other option but to put the dog to sleep. Now, they'd phoned around 14 different veterinary practices in order to get help with that decision, and they had been refused on the basis that, different reasons. So they had vets who just physically could not see that dog. They didn't have any capacity or space. There were people that weren't taking any new registrations, and because of their limited appointment availability, and they were vets that were actively refusing to euthanize healthy dogs. Now, I think it's a really difficult situation because ultimately vets have to be guided by their code of professional conduct, and that does state that a vet cannot be forced into euthanizing an animal that they're not comfortable with, but they are urged to make ongoing arrangements for that animal if they're not able to help. But from the owner's perspective, they were in an incredibly desperate situation. There was no way that they could themselves keep that dog, and they had no alternative, and really, really did need help and support. So what are the options for them if they can't get a vet to help them? Well, and that's one thing that I just wanted, all my colleagues in the profession to really consider. And the other thing is that, again, some of the larger veterinary corporate organizations have made quite public statements saying that, if any of their vets decide to, conscientiously object to performing euthanasia on an otherwise healthy animal, that they would support them. They would support their professional decision. And again, I think that's if you're working in that organization and you feel very strongly about that, that would be an incredibly supportive message for you, and you would feel that your employer, definitely has your back. But what I would urge in that situation is to think about, well, what options do people have? And also, is that kicking the can down the road or passing the buck to somebody else? What are the implications for the people who are going to step up and do the work and help and support people, despite it being a challenge, both emotionally and, does that put a disproportionate amount of pressure on them? And does that also, and the other bit I'm really concerned around is, because this subject is so divisive and it's so emotional, is people being subjected to unpleasant behavior because they are willing to do this work, and they would be willing to euthanize an animal in the face of any, in the absence of any other options. But this has an emotional impact on vets. It is, the subject of euthanasia is incredibly emotional anyway. But euthanasia, wherever you have what I would say kind of like these heightened scenarios, can be incredibly emotive, and the stress and grief is almost like supercharged from these owners who have been forced into these really difficult decisions. So it's really clear going forwards that the veterinary sector is going to be under a significant amount of emotional pressure, and it's a sector that's already suffering with its mental health. You'd have to be living under a rock not to have seen some sort of media attention, not just in the veterinary sector press, but wider around how difficult it is in the sector at the moment, and how vets are leaving in droves from the profession because of these emotional challenges. So when you look at it in summary, we have a whole load of work coming the way to the veterinary sector. We don't have a huge amount of capacity to deliver that work, and on top of that, we have it's incredibly divisive, with a number of people within the sector really morally conflicted around the request to fulfill this work. So the future for me is looking really uncertain, and as a profession, I think we need to really support each other. We need to support the people who are struggling with the situation. We need to support the people who are stepping up to do the work and make those difficult decisions. And we also need to really support our teams and individuals and pet owners who are struggling as well. And it's tough, it's emotionally draining. And I'm speaking to people pretty much every day who have got some issue with this ban and the consequences of it. So, looking ahead, what does all this mean throughout 2024? Well, I personally believe, looking at the numbers, that we're going to struggle to fulfill the neutering targets in order for people to comply with the ban. And if you were a pet owner with an XL bully, I would urge you to try and get that neutering appointment as soon as you can to make sure you hit those deadlines. What does it mean for other breeds? It really concerns me. This ban was implemented very quickly without much wider consultation on whether or not breed-specific legislation has worked in the past. I think there are some bigger questions around dog control, dog aggression that need to be addressed and continually not addressed in the UK with the consequences of rising dog attacks. Will this ban curb that? I don't think so. I don't think so, because the root cause of these dog attacks, which are things like irresponsible breeding, inappropriate dog acquisition, and lack of significant repercussions for these incidents, from a people perspective, I think until we get some of that stuff right, then it's, we're going to carry on down the same path. But this ban is a major cause of concern, and I think it's going to have huge consequences across the veterinary sector. And it's just another storm that we have to ride out. We made it through the pandemic. We've lurched straight into another cost of living crisis, and now we're being hit with, an XL bully ban, which is going to have implications on the services that we deliver. So it's going to be challenging. I will no doubt be doing further podcasts on this because it's such a broad, wide-ranging topic. But if anybody's listening and you are a pet owner, then I really do feel for you. And if anybody's listening and they are an XL bully owner, my heart really goes out to you. And for my colleagues in the veterinary sector, we hold ourselves to such high professional standards, especially when it comes to the health and welfare of animals. So I really urge you to support the pets under your care, to really help pet owners with what is potentially going to be a really difficult time and potentially some really difficult decisions. And of course, most of all, support your colleagues and your team members, because this is going to be a really challenging time. But, we have got through some really challenging times, and we can only do that as a united team.